Well, thank you, Greg and Rosetta. I think my presentation will touch a little bit on both of your guys' presentations, so it's a good segue. I'm Isaac Stein. I'm a designer with Weststate Landscape and Urban Design based in Rotterdam and New York City. But I'm actually here to present a project I completed when I was a student at school here, my thesis for undergraduate study under the guidance of Alan Schulman. My project specifically focuses on a mitigation and adaptation scenario for Miami Beach, South Beach, from 5th to 15th Street. But before I get into Miami Beach, I just want to touch a little bit about the relationship of South Florida and the landscape. This is a great quote from the 50-year anniversary of Miami Beach that said they took a slimy mangrove swamp and pumped it full of dirt, dollars, and dreams. And I think this guy's pose really, it shows a lot about the relationship between South Florida and the landscape. It's about altering it for the benefit of the built environment, for really setting claim to what is theirs, and controlling and defining nature as a threat. So going into the peninsula of Florida, not only is South Florida a peninsula, but the Miami metro region is a peninsula, with the river of grass of the Everglades to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. So it really is its own barrier island, surrounded by water on all sides. Miami is, the heart of it, the quintessential example of this area, with industry and agriculture and development reaching out into the Everglades that has been channelized, and a sort of urban front and a steel curtain along the eastern seaboard. As mentioned, this is an extremely altered landscape, and just 150 years ago, the Everglades flowed to the south and to the west. And starting with development of agricultural and for residential use, the flow of the Everglades is actually channelized to the east and has been completely, and it's the largest civil project ever completed by the United States government. This culminated in the 1950s, and it's really shaped the landscape that we live in today. Carl Fisher, one of the earliest developers of the state of Florida, said the dredge should be the emblem of the state of Florida. It is the medium that created the landscape that we live in, right? And people don't understand this, and now dredging is really unheard of in the current landscape. But here it is going through the Everglades, creating, at first, for agriculture. This is the first reason people developed South Florida, right? And this comes from the 1916 Swamp Act, where the federal government told all the states, but specifically towards Florida, that if you develop your swampland, it becomes your land. It's no longer a federal park. And so this is when the South Florida developers and invested interest realized that there's great potential for agriculture in the Everglades and the southeast coast. So this happened all the way from the Tamiami Trail to the west in Everglades City to Collins Drive and Ocean Avenue. So this is Loomis Park 100 years ago. The coconut palms you see in Loomis Park are from a failed coconut plantation that happened there. But this really didn't go over so well. This is a famous quote from an expat from the Midwest who said, he's bought land by the acre, he's bought it by the foot. But this is the first time he bought it by the gallon. So Florida became a tropical hobbyland. We reinvested and rebranded. And this is when sort of the Art Deco district, the great architecture, the great sort of aesthetic of Miami Beach and Miami and the southeast coastal region really developed. They advertised in New York City that you're freezing your ass off, but here it's nice and sunny, and Miami became the metropolis of the tropics, and Miami Beach became the winter resort that we know. So just in an extremely short time span, in 20 years, Mid-Beach comes from being a Coast Guard retreat to these Art Deco high-rises. And this has continued to evolve and developed from the winter resort to now the days of urban playground, where Miami Beach is a year-long resort. So that's just sort of, I think, an ideological understanding of how the South Florida landscape is fabricated, is altered, and it's for the benefit of urban and man environment with the degradation of the natural landscape. So Miami Beach is sort of the quintessential example of South Florida. It seems my text is a little bit cut off, but this is a quote from Carl Fisher's real estate manager, that dredges ran continuously from 1914 to 1928 to build Miami Beach. So Miami Beach is a 7-mile stretch, as you guys all know. This is a map of it from the 18th century. Here's another one. I think what's key to note is that everything west of Washington Avenue in both these maps is not land. It's water. It's mangrove swamps. It's completely gone. You see Fisher Island, all mangrove swamps. You see here South Beach with a little jut out, which is around like 17th Street. And then here's a sketch from when Miami was still called Fort Dallas, and they were doing a military examination, and the whole South Beach area is just titled Mangrove. But then very shortly after, with the benefits of industrial engineering and development, all this white sand from Key Biscayne was dredged and backfilled in to create what is now South Beach and Miami Beach. And this is basically how they did it. They built a form wall, 1 meter high. They cut down the mangroves, used it as the base course, and added the fill sand from Key Biscayne. So now Miami Beach is a historic neighborhood, built on top of mangroves, and we all love it and appreciate its value socially and economically. But the dredge is what made us appreciate it as well. Not only was it built by the dredge, but in 1976, when Miami Beach was very blighted and had really lots of economical and social issues, one of the later urban renewal projects was to actually tear everything down south of 6th Street. South of 5th was how it was marketed. And it was to dredge this sort of Venetian Disneyland lagoon to be real estate and marketed at the benefit of, at the detriment of not only the landscape, but the history that we built, the social aspects. And this sort of spurred a grassroots movement. And all these beautiful Art Deco district buildings that we now know today weren't really valued at that time. But they really became on the forefront, and maybe this is in part due to our sort of regrets of draining the Everglades, or Marjorie Stoneman's Douglas, rivers of grass, but we sort of valued what we've created. And now this leads to 12 local historic districts and 4 national historic districts in Miami Beach, which is like an insane population for the scale. And so my project and the visual images I'm going to show you focus from 5th to 15th Street. And all these blue hatches are historic buildings. So over 60% of the built environment in the private property is on the historic register. So not only is Miami Beach an extremely historical city, but it also has extreme social and economic value to the greater region. This is from the quote on the bottom is from the 750 South Florida Prosperity Plan, where they mention that Miami Beach is of tremendous value due to its economic and social input to not only Miami Beach, but to Miami and the region as a whole. There's a great book called The $1 Billion Sandbar. My title seemed cut off, but in a 15-year time period, Miami Beach brought $16 billion in hospitality taxes. And 75% of this comes from South Beach, which is a small footprint of the entire Miami Beach area. In 2014, Miami Beach tourism industry drew $9 billion last year. That's just for Miami Beach. That's not counting what Miami International Airport is getting, what people visiting the Everglades are getting, what people staying in Miami and visiting the new art museum and the like. And also Miami Beach is an extremely dense community with peak season population when everyone's staying overnight, not counting the day-to-day visitors. It's only second to Hoboken in the New York greater metro area for the United States, with 23,000 people per square mile. In a very low density setting. A very low rise setting in a high density. So beyond just the actual physical presence, Miami Beach is sort of it's the mental hub, it's the social hub of Miami. And so these are geotagged pictures uploaded to Flickr, and you can even see Lincoln Road and Ocean Drive and the cruise ships coming in and out just by pictures uploaded to the internet. In a survey taken of people's most popular destinations when they visit Miami, Miami Beach is 3 of the top 4. And we all know these iconic imageries, right? I don't need, this is more, everyone knows these. Even if you live in, Russia, you still know these imageries. But this is really, it's in crisis, and it's a crisis today, and it's a crisis to known issues of flooding and hurricanes. I think Rosetta touched on it nicely, that hurricanes is sort of it's not a really known issue here, especially in Miami Beach, because it's been a while since there has been one. Hurricane Andrew was hit quite south, and it was really since 1926 that there's been a major calamity in the South Miami Beach area. And there's always the omnipresent press of environment changing, and that, as we refer to it, as sea level rise. So this is 2009. This is a rainstorm in South Beach. Since then, there's been a lot of infrastructural Army Corps projects that have reduced these implications, but this is what it was like before we started making engineering and hard solutions. This is Hurricane Sandy, 2012. Hurricane Sandy was more than 100 miles offshore. This is Collins Canal, the same picture of the dredge I showed going down earlier. And as touched on just a moment ago, the Miami Beach is in the epicenter of hurricane tracks, which have become only more and more prevalent. So this is the last time Miami Beach was hit by a hurricane of a serious stature. Basically, it just says, fear felt for Miami Beach. There was no idea what happened. There's a great quote here that says, Miami Beach was isolated from the mainland, and no word has been received to the effect of the storm there. It is feared that a monster tidal wave has swept across the entire island city. And this happens all on the up and down the Atlantic seaboard, as it did in Rhode Island, as it does in New Jersey, as it does in Far Rockaway. This is just some of the imagery. And it's the costliest hurricane in U.S. history. It's equal to Hurricane Katrina if you exfoliate it to current value dollars, at $125 billion. So here's just sort of a topographical analysis of 5th to 15th Street in Miami Beach. You can see the green being high and blue being low. Basically, you can see where the sand dunes were and where they backfilled on top of the mangroves to create the western side. So Miami is ranked 9th in the world for a potential population exposed to coastal flooding with 5 million people in the region. And this is what Miami Beach looks like with just 1 meter of sea level rise and 2 meters of sea level rise. I'm not here to argue when these will happen, how this will happen, but I think the point to say is that this area is of extreme value, socially, economically, and at risk, and there's worth using landscape and infrastructural improvements to say how can we extend the shelf life of this said region. So Miami is the most at-risk city, and Miami Beach being sort of the crux of this economic engine of to coastal flooding by 2070 with $3.5 trillion, which would essentially be a big detriment to the United States Federal Reserves. So with this kind of understanding of the value of Miami Beach and the extent at which it is in crisis, I'm going to show you some images of how the scenario of mitigation and adaptation could look. So it's sort of looking at the landscape that we had, the present infrastructural hardcore solutions that we've created, and how can we marry the two? So you're not divorcing ourselves from the past, but really trying to create value with the landscape, but understanding the reality is that people do live here, and they do need to be safe. So combining these two layers to create a new environment where it's more of a adaptation scenario on the western side, which was once part of the mangrove swamps, and a more mitigation strategy on the higher uplands of the sand dunes. And really sort of overlaying a more naturalized landscape that can help work and evolve and adapt and be resilient to the changing tides. So really speaking to the sort of character of this area is trying to create not just a place for water to come in, but also trying to create a place for people, right? So kind of keeping this Miami Beach hub, as you saw in Flickr on the eastern side, of keeping Ocean Drive and Lincoln Road going, and then really working on creating a sort of new identity and a layered identity on the western side of Miami Beach that might harken back to some of the known conditions of the Gulf Coast and Miami region, like Stiltsville, or really creating a colonized, a channelized landscape in the sort of historic realm on the southwest corner that harkens back to the Netherlands. So as mentioned before, basically looking to really adapt everything west of Meridian Avenue and sort of mitigate and sort of extend how much the shelf life and the value incubator that is the east side of Miami Beach. So it's basically a quite simple strategy of creating shelves and plateaus and sort of tidal basins along the western side. We can see where there would be sort of 3 canals in Lenox, Jefferson, and Pennsylvania leading to Flamingo Park as sort of a tidal estuary, really reclaiming this land for the common good and the public domain, and creating a sort of a raised infrastructure like the new developments you see in Amsterdam for Alton Road and West Avenue as the main thoroughfares for development. So here's sort of how I presented the drawing 2 years ago, and it was sort of a transect across the entire island and some visual imagery of how this scenario could play out. So starting with the west side of Biscayne Bay, as you can see here, it's really moving back into the bay and trying to reinstall some of the edge and the buffer that once existed. So here is Key Biscayne around 50 years ago, and it's quite similar landscape to how Miami Beach might have looked 100 years ago. But this is the way it looks today, and this is the reality of the economy and what has come to fruition. So the proposal is sort of to marry these two and really try to find a way where we could make these interact to create a benefit both economically, socially, and environmentally. And then here's a quote basically on the bottom corner where it says, 100 years ago, you used to be able to walk 500 feet out into Biscayne Bay and it'd be waist high. But now with the dredging and the channelization, it's completely different. So moving into Alton Road and the west slots, this is that boardwalk that extended out into Biscayne Bay, 500 feet. 100 years ago, and it was a thoroughfare bordered by mangrove trees and foliage. And you can even see in the pictures here, you can see some sort of black mangroves here, some other mangroves growing, and saw palmetto, and some marsh on the foreground. And this is the way it is today, it's engineered solution, seawall, hedge planting, coconut palms, nothing native about that. But maybe there's a way to marry these two and really create sort of in this in-between space, try to create some value where it could be used for tourism, ecotourism, and maybe for people to educate themselves and understand how the ecology works. Moving into Alton Road, Miami Beach originally had a cable car system and thoroughfare, sort of elevated, stilted. And so this is old technology being reused in today. So this is 2012, before Alton Road's new pump stations were online, and this is sunny day flooding that's occurring, according to the Miami Herald, would be around this time in 2012. And then here's sort of an idea, looking at sort of the typology that exists in Mississippi and Louisiana and the Northwest Florida of stilted roads and just creating a sort of elevated environment, allowing the water and the nature ground plane to exist freely. And so moving in towards the sort of the crux of the historic district, maybe what once was large mangroves is now this, with 75-foot wide one-way streets, or two-way streets, but 75 feet wide with unnecessary width. So maybe there's a potential to give half of this public domain back to what once was there, and really allowing circulation of water and creating space for the water to come. So as you can see, it's 70 feet across, and typically in one of these streets, and just creating one-way streets and really allocating space for the water and using the fill that you cut from here to actually raise the existing grade slightly. And then moving to the east is sort of more mitigation strategies, just to help reduce the impact. So Washington Avenue used to have trolley cars. It's very straightforward. Now today it does not. How can we bring this back and really translate the environment of Miami Beach to be more responsive to the everyday user and to the environment? And then going on Ocean Drive, here is what it looked like 100 years ago up in Mid-Beach, and maybe here today it's the remnants of the coconut palm farm by the Loomis family. But maybe instead of just keeping a lawn that really creates no protection and value for the environment, we try to propagate stronger sand dunes that really can protect the landscape from hurricanes. And really as an overview, creating this whole easement of Loomis Park is really a protection barrier. And so the solution is not by any means a fix-all, but I think going back to the idea of that Miami Beach creates extreme value every year. If you're creating $10 billion a year, just within one, maybe extending the shelf life 10 years, 20 years, what is unknown is something worth talking about. And I think this kind of speaks to why we use engineered solutions and not planting solutions is it's hard. Cool. Thank you, guys.